Awesome. Well, hello. My name is Anneliese Singh. I use she and they pronouns. Welcome to our session today, Bridging the Gap, bringing together different perspectives. Before we get started, are y'all having a good time at New Orleans Book Fest? All right. Can we like applaud even louder so Walter Isaacson and Cheryl Landry can hear it? Thank you to all the volunteers, all the authors. I think we're going to have a really important conversation today. First of all, I want to introduce Mayor Marc Morial. I feel like you're a legend here on this soil, but there's some things he's been up to since in the last 15 years. So let me read your bio. So Marc H. Morial has been described as one of the few national leaders to possess street smarts and boardroom savvy. He is the current president and CEO of the National Urban League, the nation's largest historic civil rights and urban advocacy organization. He served as the highly successful and popular mayor of New Orleans. Can we give him a round of applause again? Welcome back home. He was president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, a Louisiana state senator, and was a lawyer in New Orleans with an active, high-profile practice. He is truly a leading voice on the national stage for the battle for jobs, education, housing, voting rights, equity. He's a graduate of Georgetown University Law Center and the University of Pennsylvania, and he's been recognized as one of the 100 most influential Black Americans by Ebony Magazine, one of the top 50 nonprofit leaders by the Nonprofit Times, one of the 100 most influential Black lawyers in America, and he's been inducted into the International Civil Rights Walk of Fame in Atlanta, Georgia. He is the author of the Gumbo Coalition, 10 leadership lessons that help you inspire, unite, and achieve. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, for being here and for everything you've done for our city. Thank you. And I have to say, it's also a true and deep honor to introduce Dr. Robert Livingston, a Tulane alum. Let's give a round of applause for that. Welcome home.
Thank you.
And you know, he's someone I've looked up to for quite a long time as a fellow psychologist. He is a scientist, a social scientist studying what racism and white supremacy do to our minds, our brains, our hearts, and our minds. Dr. Robert Livingston is a social psychologist and one of the nation's leading experts on the science underlying bias and racism in organizations. For 2 decades, he has served as diversity consultant to a myriad of Fortune 500 companies, public sector agencies, and nonprofit organizations. He's currently a professor at Harvard Kennedy School, and his research on race, implicit bias, leadership, and social justice have been published in top-tier academic journals, as well as the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, US Today, and the Harvard Business Review. Just, tearing it up over here. His groundbreaking book and influential approach to combating racism is detailed in his newly released book, The Conversation: How Seeking and Speaking the Truth About Racism Can Radically Transform Individuals and Organizations. I think we need some of that at Tulane and in New Orleans. And his book was, in 2021, named as Best Book by Financial Times, and it's been a finalist for the NAACP Image Award. Thank you again both for being here today. Audience, we've got 30 minutes for dialogue up here. We got 10 minutes for question. There will be a mic right there in the center aisle. And first, I wanted to get started with Mayor Marc Morial. Your book was just released in 2020. It's called The Gumbo Coalition. Yum.
Yum.
And
Spicy.
I know, spicy. And New Orleans can be a little spicy. We're going to talk about that. And you could have written about anything, but you chose to write about the Gumbo Coalition. Can you tell us what the Gumbo Coalition is and why you wrote it?
Yeah, well, look, thank you very much, and thank you to Tulane, and thank you to you, and good to be with you, Rob, and thanks to all of you all for sticking around for what is probably the final panel of the day.
Yes, we are the final panel.
Yes, so the Gumbo, the name, the moniker, the concept of the Gumbo Coalition was born during my 1994 race for mayor of New Orleans. And it was by happenstance, but it was also part vision, because we were looking for a way to describe the winning coalition we needed to build, which was in a very, very contested race, a unique race in New Orleans history, because there were 4 major Black candidates and 3 major white candidates in that race. A very, very competitive race, hard-fought race. And I was seeking a way to describe the, if you will, ethnic, religious, and makeup of the city. And it happened by happenstance. I was at a event in Broadmoor. And it was an event where the crowd was very diverse and mixed. There were blacks, there were whites, there were LGBTQ leaders in the room. And like any good New Orleans political event, gumbo was being served.
That's right.
And when you do these events and when you're out on the campaign trail, you're always looking for a new way, a clever way, a way in the moment to make your case. And I said, just by happenstance, I said, this room reminds me of the gumbo. There's a little bit of this, there's a little bit of that, there's a little over here and a little over there, and when we put it all together, it makes this great thing we all know called gumbo. Someone in the back of the room yelled out, yes, this is the Gumbo Coalition. And in fact, that's where the concept was born. One of our campaign volunteers, who happened to be an architect, came back 3 days later and had basically drawn up a graphic that said Gumbo Coalition. And superimposed behind the graphic were East Side, West Side, Uptown, Downtown, the names of neighborhoods, black, white, Latino, Asian, gay, straight, Jew, Muslim, Catholic, Protestant, Baptist. It had all of the superimpositions of all of the communities that make up the city. And that is what was born. Now, I was elected in '94 in a very racially polarized election. I got approximately 5% of the African American vote and only 10% of the white vote. But nonetheless, I determined at the very beginning that in order to govern, I had to build a broader coalition. And I needed conceptual ways that were beyond issues and ideology to sell a vision for the city. And thus, the Gumbo Coalition was a vision that only by building some bridges around here can we tackle the deeper, more systemic problems that the city face. And that was the concept, and it was born. When I ran for re-election, I received 95% of the African-American vote. At that time, 45% of the white vote, which remains a high water mark for any African-American candidate in this city running in a contested election. So we meant to build that, and thus that became the concept, this coalition of trying to find ways to build, if you will, working bridges to confront the difficult problems that the city faced. New Orleans at that time had 500 murders a year. We were at 450, 460, 470. New Orleans had the worst police department in the country. It was corrupt, and it was brutal, and it was incompetent, and it was dysfunctional. New Orleans at that time was experiencing the after effect of the oil bust of the late 1980s. We were losing jobs, we were losing population, and the civic and political, if you will, community seemed to have lost its ability to create a direction. So the Gumbo Coalition was really a way to create a new thrust and a new movement in this city.
Awesome. We're going to come back to the Gumbo Coalition for sure, and I want to get to Dr. Livingston's book. You know, in the conversation you write, my hope is that the conversation will bring people together to talk honestly about race with the goal of creating profound and sustainable social change. This book on race is neither a thesis nor a testimonial. It's a tool, it's a roadmap, it's a compass for our shared journey towards a more racially just and equitable destination. It's a goal to help us collectively make progress towards solving the perennial problem of racism, particularly as it relates to anti-Black racism in the U.S. Can you talk about why you wrote this book now?
Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me. Marc, it is an honor being next to you. I remember being here in the late 80s, early 90s. I remember Carolyn Barber Pierre, who was here when I was a student at Tulane from 1989 to 1993. Thank you for coming out. And it's just good to be back home. I haven't been to New Orleans for decades, and a lot's changed. So one of the reasons that I decided to write this book is that there's no paucity of books on racism. There are plenty of books out there that explore lots of different problems, whether it's racism in the criminal justice system, whether it's racism in housing, whether it's segregation, a lot of different topics, but there are very few books that tell you what to do to change it, to solve the problem. So I thought I would, take a bite out of that big challenge, and am I sorry that I did? This book took me 5 years of heavy labor to do, because what I wanted to do was scour the entire scientific field, from economics to political science to social psychology to sociology, and say, what has been found on what works for bringing people together? And I'm going to sort of create a compass and a roadmap for individuals and organizations to follow to lead them down that path towards a more equitable future. And so that was the goal of the book, and it was the hardest thing I've ever done. But one of the things that I argue in the book is that nothing will change if people don't start talking to one another. To have social change, you need social exchange. Human relationships provide a portal for facts to enter. And for people to change. And it took me a long time to realize that. I thought if you just gave people the facts, they look at the facts and they're like, okay, I'll do it. But there's a lot of research out there, and I'll tell you a couple of quick examples of studies that show this. So one was in the 1940s, and it was a bunch of women who were volunteers for the Red Cross, and they wanted to get them to serve more organ meat, hearts, livers, kidneys, things that people normally don't eat. And they gave half of the women, because they divided them into two groups, so it was kind of this randomly assigned study where they gave half the women good reasons. They said it's nutritious, we'll save money, there are food shortages, all of these rational reasons that they should do it. And then in the other half, they gave them the same rational reasons, but the only difference is they gave them 30 minutes to talk about it amongst themselves. And what they found is that the group that just got the information rose from 0% compliance to 3% compliance. So there was a little bit of change. But the group that got to talk about it, 35% of them started serving organ meat. So it went from 0 to 35%. So there's something about this process of bringing people together, right, and having them talk about whatever the problem is and hear one another, and I talk about how to have a productive conversation, is key to, I think, changing hearts and minds and, more importantly, behaviors. So that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, I love it. And I love what you say in the book is that racism is a solvable problem. And I think about Mayor Morial, just your belief and your kind of vision that we can do this,
Yeah, I think what is daunting, but what is also exciting is for us to recognize where we are in America in 2022. And it's, when I say realize where we are, I would encourage people to think ahead. One of the things we don't do when we discuss race or we discuss the nation is we don't really have a clear vision of where we want to go. What is the vision for the future of the country? Well, I understand the vision to mean that we are building something that has not really been built in humankind, and that is a multicultural, multi-religious, multi-orientation democracy. When has it ever been built? Where there is candidly not a majority ethnic group. If you study history, you may see multinational empires, but they've been built with force, with the bayonet. Think of the Romans, think of the Greeks, think of what Germany tried to do, think of what Putin is trying to do, to use force to consolidate. In this nation, I think that vision is a vision I hold dearly. And I think if we don't embrace that vision and understand that vision, we're going to have a difficult road as a nation. You cannot go forward by looking in the rearview mirror. You cannot go forward by trying to recreate yesterday. Let me say something that's, I think important. In the early 1900s, the United States went through significant social transformations. Number one, you had a society shifting from being a predominantly rural society more to an urban society as it aligned itself with the shift towards industrialization. You had some significant social forces taking place. You had immigration from Western and Eastern Europe. You had migration of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North. All of these forces are taking place at the same time. Inside of the immigration transformation from Europe was something also very distinct. We were, before 1900, an overwhelmingly Protestant nation. The new immigrants that were coming here from Europe were not decidedly Protestant. They were Catholic Italians, they were Catholic Irish, they were Jewish people from Eastern Europe. And that transformation, if you read the newspapers at the time, and I haven't gotten to the black migration issue, if you read the newspapers at the time, newspapers like the New York Herald Tribune and some of the leading newspapers thought it was the destruction of America that was taking place. All of these hordes coming here, they couldn't speak the language, they didn't know the culture. Why are they coming here? Then on top of that, you had this mass migration. Millions of black people from the South fleeing the Klan, fleeing terrorism, fleeing the decline of Reconstruction, fleeing the Great Betrayal, fleeing the decline of the cotton economy, and they're coming to American cities. And that too was panned by commentators, by newspapers, by people of the times, as though something that this nation could not navigate and absorb. Why do I say that? Not because it is a perfect analogy to the present, but because we must recognize that the nation is in a constant transformation from a social, religious, and racial dimension. And today, the future of this country has got to be the multicultural democracy, because the demographics are going to be what they are. And young people are bringing their sensibilities around a whole range of social issues. So we have to construct that. And if we have a tension and a battle taking place, undergirding it are discussions that are difficult about race. Undergirding it, there are discussions that are difficult about gender and gender orientation. Underneath it, there are discussions that are difficult about religion and its role in American life. Difficult discussions that we have to have more openly and more transparently. But what misses, and I think it's missing in our political discourse, and I think even sometimes those of us who are in the arena, we have got to get people, I think, focused on what the vision is for the future. Because sometimes what you have is a fear of the vision. Some people lose power, some people lose privilege, some people gain power, some people may gain standing if we try to create a nation that is more equitable. And that's the challenge that we face in the country today. And I think it undergirds the swirl of everything that is going on. But I look back to the early 1900s and I say this: if you had not had immigration and you had not had migration, we would not have had the power of the industrial economy that made America the economic power it became in the second half of the 20th century. Had you not had immigration and you had not had migration, you would not have had the capacity that the military had to basically create in the late 30s and the early 40s to vanquish Hitler and Hirohito. And sometimes people don't realize that the social transformation that took place became one of the assets that allowed America to transform itself in a profound way in the middle of the 20th century and in the second half of the 20th century.
Well, and you're talking about all that history, and I think you know that history, so you were very clear as mayor building that gumbo coalition. But I think what comes up as well is, what do we need to be talking about in bridging this gap that we have in these divided perspectives? And I think, maybe even thinking, we heard in different stages at the book festival today, how divided are we today, and should we be shocked about that, or is that just how we've always been? So this question is for you, Dr. Livingston. who should actually be talking? I know after George Floyd was murdered, a lot of black folks were like, we didn't create the system of anti-black racism and indigenous erasure. White folks and non-black folks benefited from that structure, that racial hierarchy. We don't want to be in the conversation, right? We want to see conversations to action, right? And so I'm curious if you can weigh on that. Like, are we really divided? And if we are, what do we need to do about it? What conversations do we need to have?
So it's a great question. I think it's a complicated question. To answer it fully would take, hours. But the short answer is yes, we are really divided. We are divided along racial fault lines. We are divided along ideological fault lines. We're divided along religious fault lines. Like we are divided as a nation, and I think more polarized than we've been in decades. So, part of it, and you've asked this question, what is the fear of having the conversation? And I think the fear is really the truth. And I'll give you an analogy to explain what I mean by that, because the subtitle of my book is How Seeking and Speaking the Truth About Racism Can Radically Transform Individuals and Organizations. But there has to be an appetite for the truth. And I remember when I was a child, my parents told me about Santa Claus and how if I was good or bad, presents would magically appear under the tree. And up until the time, I think I was a late believer because my friends were like, no, there's no Santa Claus by the age of 9 or 10, right? And I'm like, yes, there is, yes, there is. So I was kind of late coming to the truth party on that. But when parents tell their kids that, the goal is not the truth. They're doing it to create a certain emotional experience. They're doing it to instill a sense of wonder and joy and excitement. And I think when we talk about this whole critical race theory controversy, we have to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of education? And I was told the purpose of history is to explore facts about our past, what actually happened. But it could be that it's akin to Santa Claus. That really what we're trying to do is tell people stories to make them feel good, to make them not feel guilty, and to increase patriotism. And that's okay. People can make that decision. A school system can make that decision. But what I'd like to see is, sort of sincere and candid ownership of that, to say, this doesn't have anything to do with the truth. This has to do with propaganda, ideology, that there is a deliberate motivation to create a certain sense of commitment and investment, and we think a lie, or at least a half-truth, or romanticized, idealized truth is the best way to that. I actually think the real truth is the best way to any sort of justice or problem solving. But, if they said that, that would be great. But I think that would make us no different from China, that has erased the whole Tiananmen Square incident. Young Chinese people don't even know that existed. It would be no different than Russia, that I think in the future will not have the truth about Ukraine. It will be that we went to save people who were controlled by neo-Nazis and drug addicts. So I think that is the conversation. So why do we not want to have the truth? I think it's what Mayor Morial said. There's a fear of sacrifice. There's a fear that if things change, and things are pretty good for a big chunk of the white population, that it means giving up something. It means, that there's going to be a certain amount of sacrifice. And I think people just want to sweep things under the rug and keep them the way that they are. And the longer that happens, the greater this wound will fester. And so I'm not sure, and that's one of the reasons I wrote this book, is to sort of give people a tool for how to have a civil and productive conversation around these issues, focused on the facts, focused on data. There's very little in the book that's about my life or my experience or my opinion about racism. It's all about the facts. It's all about data. It's all about what happens if you send out an identical resume, but for half the people, the name is Lakeisha, and the other half, the name is Emily. Who actually gets called back more, right? There are empirical answers to this question. Like, it's not sort of a subjective thing, whether there's racism or not. We can test with any number of methodologies whether it exists, and we can talk about what it means when it does exist and more importantly, what we want to do about it, if anything. So I think that's what the conversation needs to focus on.
What I love as a fellow researcher that you kind of put it in science terms, we have this condition, racism, and we have this concern, do we care? Where are we morally? And then correction. You said sacrifice. He's got a great model in the conversation. I hope you look at that. It's called press. Maybe we can come back to that. Mayor Morial, once we have the history, once we lay down the science, and once we talk about who's actually responsible for generating these conversations, we got to cross the ditch. You use this kind of idea, the ditch, throughout the Gumbo Coalition. You talked about growing up, you would cross the ditch between Pontchartrain Park, an African-American neighborhood built to keep black folks out of Gentilly Woods, a white neighborhood. And then you talk about how you cross so many ditches, predominantly white Christian brothers, and then going back to Pontchartrain Park, you talked about kind of being as comfortable in the C-suites as you were in the streets. Can you talk about that proverbial ditch and what we need to be doing to cross it right now?
So thank you very much. And so the ditch, you can go see the ditch. It's real. It's not an imaginary concept. In some communities and neighborhoods, a division was the tracks or some big boulevard, a street, or a highway. And where I grew up, I think when I reflect on it, it was rather unique because Gentilly Woods was a subdivision built you all know what Gentilly Woods is? Gentilly Woods was a subdivision built after World War II for working class white families who would buy their houses with mortgages backed by the FHA and by the VA. And so you had a lot of returning veterans, a lot of young couples and families. And it was a neighborhood that was built between probably 47, 48, and maybe the late 1950s. The city fathers, in an effort to defeat the pressure to integrate neighborhoods, and in the Morrison administration, they sought to sort of take separate but equal with some literal means. Said, well, why don't we build a black subdivision? And if we build a black subdivision, it will keep the black people out of the white neighborhood. So we're going to build this subdivision. It's going to be a mirror image of Gentilly Woods, same layout, same type of houses, to appeal to the same type of families except for black families. That neighborhood became Pontchartrain Park. Inside of Pontchartrain Park, there was a golf course. That was the golf course to keep black people from playing at City Park or Audubon Park. There was a university there, Southern University at New Orleans. Campus built to keep blacks from integrating what was then LSUNO, now UNO. There was a public school there, Mary Dora Coghill Elementary School, to keep the black children from going to William C.C. Claiborne Public School. But there was one Catholic school, St. Gabriel's Catholic School, which was located in the white community. The Archdiocese had a plan and a plot of land. That plot of land was on the corner of Mithra and Congress, where they were going to build a black parish, a black Catholic parish and a black Catholic school. They never got around to doing it. So that land was the last place houses were built in Pontchartrain Park in the mid to late 1960s. Pontchartrain Park and Gentilly Woods were separated by a ditch, a long, long, dry ditch, which only filled up when there were heavy rains or some sort of monsoon-style weather event. So we, who lived in Pontchartrain Park, began to go to school. The first year the schools were integrated in New Orleans. My older sister went in 62, I went in 63. We went over to St. Gabriel's in Pontchartrain Park. To get there, we had to either walk all the way down, cross over, and come all the way back, or we could just go right through the ditch. Sneak through a little side gate in the fence, and so traveling through that ditch. What I learned as a young student is that in the afternoons, when we got off from school, we were commonly chased by older white boys back to Pontchartrain Park from the gates of St. Gabriel's all the way back through the ditch, which was about a 2.5 block run or walk, back to our own neighborhood. So the ditch became the proverbial, not only it was the dividing line, it was also the safe haven. We got to the ditch, we got to Pontchartrain Park, we were safe. We were not going to be threatened or called names or chased or feeling threatened. That ditch and my life at that time and the handful of black students that went to St. Gabriel at that time, we learned to live in two worlds, right? We lived in Pontchartrain Park, and that was our home, and that was our friends, and those were our neighbors. And then we went to St. Gabriel. So when I was growing up, I had a group of white friends, and I had a group of black friends. White friends didn't know the black friends didn't know the white friends. That's just the way it was. You played with your white friends at school, you played with your black friends back at home. And so that ditch and crossing that ditch and understanding what it meant was so profound in my early life to understand not only to understand, I always felt that racism was cruel and mean, but I always at that kind of felt like people were also very the same. You know, I'd go over here, play touch football with the white boys at school, then I'd go home, play touch football with white boys in the neighborhood. There was so much similarity, yet distinction in this life. It gave me a bit of an abiding faith in the human dimension. The idea that people can and will overcome if they can get beyond their fear, their miseducation, their sense of what they've been taught. Here's one of the problems we face when it comes to things like critical race theory. The problem's the problem's the adults. The problem are adults who were miseducated, uneducated, maleducated, afraid of their children being exposed to the truth. And that's fundamentally what it is. So all of a sudden now you have politicians who are now have become, in places like Virginia, experts on school curriculum, right? They don't know diddly squat about nothing, but they're gonna legislate on what can be taught in classrooms. Why weren't you legislating about chemistry and biology and physics? Why weren't you doing that if you're such an expert? So we have this now. I just believe that when I led this city and in the work I do now, that in many respects, because I was the mayor of the city, I had the power and the ability to force people sometimes to collaborate. I had a forcing mechanism, right? Because of where I stood. I control money, I control power. I could use it as a carrot, I could use it as a stick to try to force people to work together. I could lead by example, right? When I put my administration together, I sought a diverse administration. Men, women, blacks, whites. I appointed the first openly LGBTQ person to my cabinet, not because anyone pressured me to do it, but because I wanted to do it. I appointed the first Asian Americans to any position on any board or commission in New Orleans. I did it because I wanted to do it and I believed in doing it, not because someone came and knocked my door down or protested at the gate. What is the point? Leaders have to bring vision and have to bring foresight and also have to be willing to push against the grain. What has happened in this country today, let's talk about the elephant in the room, is the orange man who was the 45th president of the United States, who normalized hatred, raised it to a political level of legitimacy and normalcy. Cleverly and clumsily, he used incidents, whether it was African American players protesting or the moniker of building a wall, or any number of things to animate and divide the country. So that legitimization, in my opinion, in some ways put us back, but in other ways forces us to the moment where it is no longer, I think, acceptable, or the notion that the less we talk about race and division and history, the better off we are. You know, that's a prevailing point of view in some quarters. Let's just not talk about it, it'll kind of go away. The orange man, right? The 45th president of the United States did, and my mother, you know, who is was a civil rights leader in this town, along with my father, said, I look at this man and I see Leander Perez. I look at this man and I see George Wallace. She said, but you know, Leander Perez was just a district attorney of Plaquemines Parish. This man is the president of the United States. We never felt threatened by Leander Perez. We didn't like him. We thought he was a threat. This man is the president of the United States. This is the elephant in the room, guys, is the legitimization. So now what do you see? You see other politicians modeling that in some of their rhetoric, in some of their policies, in an effort to make a political point. So I think, to be quite honest with you, I think American politicians are far more divided than the American people. I think the American people would prefer a leadership approach that helped them navigate responsibly the difficulties we face in the country. And I think politicians who, and I'm speaking as someone that grew up in politics and ran for public office, are so intent on maintaining power, so intent on re-election, so intent and lacking in courage to lead by persuasion, right, that their actions exacerbate what we face today. So what does that mean? This is why I say to business leaders, faith leaders, community-based leaders, you got to step up and lead in your own way and in your own method and in your own institutions. And you cannot be intimidated into not doing what you know is the right thing to do to lead your institution, but don't be intimidated by politics and don't be intimidated by the rhetoric of those who don't want to see this occur. It's not the best case scenario for the country, but if we do not confront what we're facing in this country, history teaches us that it is none other than a vicious cycle. Let me say this, and I want to say this because this is important.
We're going to ignore this, by the way. We're going to take another 10 minutes on this panel. Just
my good
FYI.
friend, when I served as mayor, and I'm going to quote him, was Dennis Archer, the mayor of Detroit, former Supreme Court Justice in Michigan, who said, here's the problem. If we don't solve and fix and create a more equitable America, what happens when the old minorities become the new majorities? Do they simply say, we're going to do what was done to us? And then have we solved anything? Have we made the nation strong? We got to fix this. So this is an appeal to, quite candidly, white Americans. We got to deal with this now, and we have to create a value system of true equity, a value system of equality, a value system to get beyond where we are. Or this is just one of these cycles. It repeats, it morphs. It has variance in it. And if we don't, and so that's really, I know I've taken a long time to say this, but I wanted to say it because there's so many things we kind of dance around, you know, and I just think that the less we dance around it, the more we're going to, I don't have any secret formula. I wrote a book. I don't have any no tried and true method. What I do have is the will to say to this nation and to say to anyone who will listen, let us confront this, let's do it together, let's do it responsibly.
Well, I think that's what we want to come back to leadership, and that's my question for you, Dr. Livingston, is what do leaders need to know? Like, there's so much science that I think leaders don't know. You've done so much equity, diversity, inclusion work with a variety of companies, organizations, nonprofits. Where do you see leaders fail, and what's the science they need to know to kind of further the conversation and connect that to action?
Well, out of respect to the audience, I'll pass on my answer in the interest of time and open it up to you guys if you have any questions that you want to pose. So
Well, and are y'all okay
let
with
that
an extra 10 minutes on this panel? We've got last panel of the day privilege. All right. Okay. Raise your hands if you're okay with that.
Okay.
See those hands?
Okay.
We want to hear from you. Yeah, we want to hear from you.
Okay.
Yeah.
So part of it is, and I will callously defer people to the book because I'll say in 240 pages what I can only say very quickly here in 4 or 5 minutes. But the press model that you referred to before, Anneliese, is sort of a 5-stage model for how to make profound and sustainable change toward greater racial equity. The P is problem awareness. The R is root cause analysis. The E is empathy or concern. The S is strategy, and the second S is sacrifice. So it goes something like this. To solve any problem, whether it's climate change, whether it's addiction, you have to sort of know that there's a problem there. But the problem is so many people are in denial. So there are people who are battling addiction who don't think that they are. There are people who deny the fact that climate change is real. And similarly, there are white people who deny that racism is a real thing. And it's a much bigger number than you might suspect. If you don't acknowledge that there's a problem, then the solution is dead in the water. Not only that, if you don't acknowledge that there's a problem, leaders who attempt to establish diversity policies will find that their employees see the solution as the problem because they don't believe that there's a problem with racism anyway. And so what you've essentially done is created a special favor. So I think the very first step to solving any problem is acknowledging that there is a problem and, in fact, specifying what the problem is and making sure that everyone understands that and is on the same page. The next step is root cause analysis. So, if you're sick, sometimes people don't know that they're sick because you can have cancer and not know it. And that's a problem because you won't get treatment. But sometimes you can have severe symptoms like headache or nausea, and the doctor's job is to then diagnose you, to perform a root cause analysis. Why? Because headaches can be caused by lots of things. They can be caused by stress and anxiety. They can be caused by coronavirus. They can be caused by dehydration. And you have to sort of understand the cause in order to know the best prescription or treatment, because treating a headache that's due to coronavirus is very different than treating a headache that's caused by stress and anxiety than treating a headache that's caused by coronavirus. So is there a problem? What's causing it? The problem is most Americans, to the extent that they do acknowledge that racism exists, they have no idea what the root cause is. They think it's really a situation where you have some bad apples, George Floyd, or Derek Chauvin, for example, that kneels on the neck of George Floyd for 9 minutes. And if we get rid of the bad cops, then everything will be great in the land of Oz. They don't understand the role of history, of laws themselves. Mayor Morial talked about sort of FHA. There's a wonderful book called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein that talks about the role of the federal government in creating systemic racism. There's mass incarceration, lots of books on that. So it's more diffuse than just a few rotten apples. It's not the fish, it's the entire water of the ecosystem. And if you want to fix racism, it goes beyond just identifying and firing bad cops. It goes to the entire structure of the police department, for example. So once you know there's a problem, that's problem awareness, root cause analysis, the next big question, and I think this is the million-dollar question, is, do you care? And I think that's the question that no one asks because they assume that they care themselves and they assume other people care. But what I'll argue is anti-racism in many ways is a conflict of interest for white people. They're sort of dismantling a system that was set up to benefit them. And so at best, many times there's apathy. At worst, there's complicity or active culpability. And so I think people have to really dig in and understand, how much do I care about solving the problem? Because any solution is worthless without implementation. It's almost like a diet. Someone says, if they don't really care if I'm like 2 or 3 pounds overweight and I don't care, you give me a diet, that won't do any good, even if the diet's great, because I don't care enough to follow the prescriptions of that diet. So the question is, do you care? And what do you care about more? Because people may care. It's like the diet. It'd be nice. I care. It'd be nice to lose 3 pounds. But what am I willing to do? It'd be nice, but I don't care enough to actually change my lifestyle. So assuming that people care enough, then the question is strategy. Do you know what to do? And then sacrifice. Are you actually willing to do it? And so what I do is lead leaders down this sort of 5-stage path to diagnose where their organization is for each of those. But the leaders always want to jump straight to solutions, which in my opinion is akin to a patient walking to an office with a headache and telling the doctor, just prescribe me some ibuprofen. And the doctor's like, no, I've got to do some tests. No, just prescribe me some ibuprofen. And no self-respecting physician would do that. If they did, it would just treat the symptoms and the disease, would remain intact, which means you would have a headache again. So I think there has to be sort of a holistic approach to solving the problem. And, if we have any hope of achieving a sustainable solution rather than just a Band-Aid over a gaping wound.
Yeah, and Darren from the Ford Foundation was talking about having a framework, right? So I think that's why I love the press model. Let's give them a round of applause. We don't have enough time, but we're going to take at least another 10 minutes to get to your questions. There is a microphone right in the center aisle. Please walk up to the microphone and we can take your questions. And if we don't have questions, I have a lightning round. We got Shelby Norman in the house. He's got a question. This is our EDI office program manager. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you both for being here. It was really enlightening to hear from both of you in terms of your experiences and your application of those experiences in terms of coalition building and bridge building. So I have, and you both spoke to this a little bit, but I have maybe a more specified way of asking this question, and it's kind of a two-parter. The first one is, what inspired your personal measure of successful bridge and coalition building? And the second part of that is, how can those of us who are focused specifically in anti-Black racism and racial equity based work tap into specific historical and political precedents that lead towards a more holistically altruistic society rather than one that is about incentivized buy-in?
All right, it's a big question.
Yes, so some very
That's a good one.
tough questions. Sometimes my work is compelled by necessity, right? The necessity to solve deep problems and the thought that they can only be done through coalition building and bridge building. Some of it is compelled by my deep and abiding commitment to racial justice, which is part of how I was raised, part of how I grew up, and part of how I like to see society that energized and animated me to do the things I've done. I think that there's a generation out there that is now creating a new ethos around racial justice. I think what Rob has spoken about and the conversations around frameworks and strategies and approaches is new thinking that treats racism as what it is, systemic in nature and a social disease as well, versus thinking about it only as a question of personal attitude or bigotry, right? One could be, bigotry is different than racism. Racism is a system. Bigotry is a personal code of behavior. So I think the thinking about it and the, if you will, move now for many, many institutions to try to tackle it through equity, diversity, and inclusion offices, equity, diversity, and inclusion strategies, equity, and diversity, and inclusion commitments. We won't know the impact of these things, I think, for another decade. Whether it is, quote, a flash in the pan, a moment in time, a public relations response to a deep American tragedy, the murder of George Floyd, or whether it is a sustainable movement to truly transform American institutions. I believe the touchstones are going to be what happens in higher ed, and what happens in corporate America. And I'll tell you why. That's where the resources are. There's no constrainment. There's not the same level of constrainment of resources in corporate America and in higher ed. Not just financial resources, but resources of intellectual capital and the ability and knowledge to do things. American business is good at tackling problems, if they do, as Rob has indicated. They identify the problem. They look for the root causes. They develop a strategy to solve it. They put money behind it. They put somebody in charge, and they measure its success. If you treat the problem of racism and institutional racism in the same way, then you're much more likely to get those results. But I think we're now hewing and architecting a new, if you will, phase in this important battle. I never heard people use the term, or everyone was hesitant to use the term structural racism, institutional racism, hesitant to even focus on equity for fear that it was going. So the fact that now this terminology, you have classes, you have seminars, you have people studying it, these to me are positive seeds that are being planted, that have to be watered, they have to grow if this is going to be sustainable. I'm often asked, what do I think of all the commitments that were made 18 months ago in the aftermath of George Floyd? I say candidly, it is extremely difficult for me to know whether they are working or not, because 18 months is a short period of time to dismantle a 400-year-old system, right? And I would say that from my vantage point, I see several for whom it has been a sustainable commitment. I see some for whom it was a public relations stunt, and I see others that let the moment go by without any commitment.
Yep. All right, Dr. Livingston.
So I'll add really quickly. So I think what's unique about this moment is, well, first of all, I think it coincides with an ever-growing gap in wealth, and not just the racial wealth gap, but if we look at the sort of average earning of an average employee versus the CEO, it's much wider now than it was 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. And so what that means is changing the system the way that it is now not only benefits people of color, it benefits most white people too. And that's always been the way. And so I think what we need to do, and there are lots of books that have been written about this to some of us by Heather McGhee. I mean, there's tons that talk about the rational basis for everyone working together to create a better society. And I think people are becoming more aware of the fact that it's not a zero-sum game. And if it is, it's a zero-sum game between the top 1% and everyone else, not black and white people. And I see that as being a catalyst for bringing people together to work towards a more just and equitable system that benefits everybody.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, we'll take 2 quick questions. Next up.
All right. Hi. Thank you all for being here. My name is Kadir. I go to high school, and my question is, how do you all feel about our current president's, basically how much effort he's been putting into solving the issue of racism?
Dr. Livingston, you want to take this one first?
Sure. So I don't think anyone, this president, the previous president, the president before that, has really done enough. And I think part of it is because they're constrained by the system, right? They're constrained by constituencies. I do a lot of work in private industry. I like working in private industries because, as you described, it's more like a dictatorship. If they decide they're going to do it, they can do it. I think a lot of public leaders don't have that same power. And being a president, there's so much there's so many different layers and levels that you have to pass through. There's Congress, there's lots of things. And so I don't think enough has been done, but I don't even think enough has been tried by this president. Sure, we have a black woman who's a nominee on the Supreme Court, and sure, we have a lot of symbolic gestures and individual sort of outcomes, but I haven't seen the sort of systemic change. And again, it's not just Biden, to pick on him, certainly not Trump, but among any of our past presidents. Maybe Lyndon B. Johnson was the last one that made really profound systemic change. I don't see it happening, and I'm quite disappointed about it.
Yeah.
So my point of view is a comparative point of view. This president has been more explicit about race than any president in American history. The nomination of a black woman to the Supreme Court is not symbolic. The Supreme Court is a powerful position. The nomination of a black woman as Vice President of the United States is not symbolic. She could become President of the United States. The nomination of 2 black people to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors is a significant step because of the role of the Federal Reserve in bank regulation, interest rates, and the overall economy. I've watched every president. Lyndon Johnson is my favorite because of what he was able to do. But I think Joe Biden has been stymied on 2 main things that we as a community wanted. One was the George Floyd Justice and Policing bill because of a filibuster in the United States Senate. The other are 2 voting rights bills that were stymied because 2 members of the Democratic caucus don't have the courage to buck a filibuster. That's where we are in the country. So I'm not an apologist for Joe Biden, but I do look at facts. And while it may be easy for people to say, well, I don't feel he's done enough, I got to go look at the facts. Got record numbers of African Americans appointed to the federal judiciary, record number of those are not symbolic positions, because at some point they're going to be able to make a call on something very material and very significant. And I think we have to understand government. I think one thing that is correct, presidents have to deal with constituencies. I think we saw this with Barack Obama, and I think we're going to see it with Joe Biden, and that is how to navigate your role in promoting racial justice and undoing racism without having a backlash from white America that completely disables your ability to lead. That's real politics.
And we're getting the hook on this
Yeah,
side of the state. So Dr. Lewis.
so I'm just going to do a quick follow-up to that, and I'll start by asking you a question, young man. Do you know in what year the first black person was elected to the U.S. Senate? So not a state senator, but an actual U.S. senator that went to Washington, D.C. Can you take a wild guess as to what year that happened? And it's okay, no right or wrong, just a wild guess. Spit out what's the first thing that comes to your mind.
Okay, I'm going to go with 1942.
Yeah, and many people say 1942, 1960, maybe 1970. The answer is 1870. And what I'm saying by that, and this is sort of to politely disagree with Marc's point, we've had black senators for a long time. We've had black millionaires for a long time. There have been black individuals going to Harvard for a long time. So any measure of economic attainment, political attainment, educational attainment, we've always had individuals. So no, I don't think that one black woman is going to change structural racism in America. I think with Thurgood Marshall, there was still structural racism in America. And so in that sense, I think it is symbolic, but I think it's also important. So to say it's symbolic is not to say that he shouldn't do it, or that it's not to serve as a role model for young black women, or to represent our country, because the Supreme Court is not a private corporate board. It is actually a body that makes laws about our country that affects everybody. So it would be ridiculous to have a group of white men making decisions about whether a woman should or should not have an abortion or when she should have an abortion. So I think that it is important to have a representation on the court that reflects who we are as a nation. But I think in many ways that's also symbolic, especially because of who she's replacing, right? I think in terms of a consequential different outcome or whatever, the Supreme Court will remain in the same balance. But what I would like to see is more legislation and more action towards actually changing the structure and not just changing the individual composition of certain organizations and certain government bodies.
So I want to respond to this.
Okay.
I think we're going to
Because
definitely
what he
get
said
the hook.
was legislation. A president can't pass legislation.
There's
So
going to be
this
an after
tells you
party here,
vote-
I think.
Vote in the midterms. The composition of the Congress. Now, I'll say this.
But his question was whether Biden had done enough, not whether a president
it's-
can change legislation. That
Well,
was his
you know
question.
what? Let me say this about whether Biden had done enough. None of them have done enough.
Well, that's what I said.
But the point of the matter is that I have to be realistic about and fair and balanced about what I see in Joe Biden.
Okay.
You can't change government if you don't change the people in charge. That's why who the HUD secretary is isn't symbolic. They determine where the money goes, where the policy is. That's why who is the Secretary of Health and Human Services is going to determine what the policy is, how it's executed.
I want to see a
Government
president
is not a machine.
that's going to change the quality of life for the average black person living in America. And until I see that, and I have not seen that with Joe Biden, I want a president that's going to change the distribution of wealth. I want a president that's going to change the disparate health outcomes from COVID and other morbidities and, women who die at childbirth. There's lots of things that I would like to see changed at the aggregate level and not at the individual
I
level.
want to see it too, but the president is not a king.
I know, but his question was, how much has Joe Biden done?
Yeah, but you.
And
And
this is the
I don't think, and I
conversation.
said, I don't think he can. This is not
You
to
said,
impugn
I
Joe
want a
Biden.
President, you said, I want a president to pass legislation. President don't pass
No,
legislation.
structural change. I want a president that's going to, or not, or Congress or citizens. But what I want to see is someone to bring about structural
I
change.
want to see it too, but you don't get to it unless people change the legislative branch of government. The reason why the material things that we as a civil rights community could not get done in the last year have everything to do with two people in the United States Senate and a filibuster from the Republicans.
I agree.
That is why this president could have did jumping jacks, flew over the Empire State Building, could have swam across the Mississippi and down the Hudson, and he wouldn't have changed the vote in the United
I
States
get it,
Senate.
Mark. That's my point. He's constrained by the system, which is why I said I like dealing with private corporations because they're like dictatorships.
Yeah,
and our government isn't a dictatorship. They can do what they want. But I will say, too, on top of all of this, I think there are 5 pillars of systemic racism. Voter rights is at the very top of that. I think that is the most important right that we need to protect. I think voter rights is a pillar of systemic racism, criminal justice, health care, public education, right? And there is a 5th one that I'm forgetting. But I think economic inequality. So access to job, wealth, right? So the economic inequality is the 5th one. I think if you address those things, you sort of start to demystify systemic racism and what it is. So I completely agree with Mayor Morial that the whole voter rights and under assault, what we're seeing here is a tremendous threat and maybe one of the biggest, because if you can't control who's governing you, who's governing the money, then you've really lost all hope. But that's very different than your question, which is, do I think Joe Biden has done enough for black people?
And folks, this
And I
is the
don't.
conversation. Let's give them a warm
All right.
round of applause.